One of the most uncomfortable moments a man can experience in a relationship is realizing something he doesn't want to admit. She doesn't respect him anymore. Not openly, not dramatically, but you can feel it in the tone of her voice, in the way she reacts to your opinions, in the way she talks about you in front of others. And the worst part is that many men don't realize when this shift begins. They only notice it months or years later, when the dynamic has already changed completely. In this video, we're going to talk about the moment men start realizing they've lost respect in a relationship, and the subtle signs that reveal it long before most men are ready to see it. What makes this moment so confusing for many men is that nothing dramatic seems to happen. There's no explosion, no major betrayal, no obvious turning point that you can clearly point to and say, that's when everything changed. Instead, what many men experience is something far more subtle, a quiet shift. And the reason it's so difficult to notice is because relationships rarely change all at once. They change slowly, gradually, almost invisibly. Imagine a man named Daniel. Daniel is 42 years old. He's been in a relationship for years. From the outside, everything about his life looks stable. He works, he pays the bills, he shows up for the relationship. There are no dramatic crises. If someone asked him about his relationship, he would probably say something like, "Things are good, normal." And for a long time, that's exactly what he believed. But small things started happening that Daniel didn't pay much attention to, not at first. A slightly different tone when she spoke to him, a small correction in front of others, a moment where she dismissed an opinion he had about something simple. Nothing that seemed worth starting a conflict over, nothing that seemed serious enough to question the entire relationship. So Daniel did what most men do. He ignored it. Because from his perspective, reacting to something small feels unnecessary. Maybe she was tired, maybe she was stressed, maybe he was overthinking. So the moment passes. Then something similar happens again. Maybe they're having dinner with friends, and Daniel says something, a story, a comment, an opinion, and she interrupts him, not aggressively, just enough to correct him. "You're exaggerating." Or maybe that's not really what happened. Everyone laughs lightly and the conversation continues. To everyone else, it looks harmless. But something about the moment feels strange. Daniel can't quite explain why. He just feels slightly smaller in the conversation. And because the moment is small, he lets it go. After all, it's just one moment. But what many men don't realize is that these moments rarely happen in isolation. They start forming a pattern, a different tone, a small eye roll, a joke at his expense, a decision being made without asking his opinion. Each one, by itself, seems insignificant, too small to confront, too small to turn into an argument. So the relationship continues. Life moves forward. Weeks pass, months pass, and Daniel still believes everything is fine. But something inside the dynamic has already started changing. And the strange part is, most men don't notice when the shift begins. They only notice when the change becomes impossible to ignore. At first, Daniel still tells himself that nothing is really wrong. Relationships go through phases, everyone has bad days, and besides, if there was a real problem, it would be obvious, right? So he continues the same way he always has. He works, he handles responsibilities, he tries to keep the peace when small disagreements happen. But slowly, the small moments begin to feel less random. They start forming a pattern. He notices that when he gives an opinion, she reacts differently than she used to. In the beginning of the relationship, she was curious about what he thought. Now she often seems impatient with it. Sometimes she corrects him. Sometimes she dismisses the idea entirely. Sometimes she doesn't even respond. And Daniel can't quite explain why that bothers him more than it should. Because technically, nothing major happened. There was no huge fight, No betrayal, no dramatic confrontation, just a growing number of moments where he feels slightly out of place in his own relationship. Then another moment happens, one of those moments that seems small to everyone else in the room, but to him it lands differently. They're with friends again. The conversation shifts towards something Daniel knows a lot about, maybe work, maybe finances, maybe something he has experience in. Daniel starts explaining his perspective. Halfway through the sentence, she interrupts, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a tone that feels strangely condescending. "Oh, come on, that's not really how it works." The group laughs lightly. Someone makes a joke. The conversation moves on, and Daniel smiles too, because that's what you do in moments like that. You smile, you move the conversation forward, you pretend the moment didn't bother you. But inside, something feels different. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to embarrassment. A subtle awareness that the dynamic in the room shifted for a second. And the uncomfortable part is that Daniel doesn't say anything. Not in that moment, not later, not the next day. He simply absorbs it. Because most men are trained to believe that reacting emotionally to something small makes the situation worse. So instead of confronting it, he adjusts. He speaks a little less. He argues a little less. He lets certain comments pass. And over time, something very subtle begins happening inside the relationship. Daniel starts participating less in his own authority, not consciously, but quietly. The strange thing is that the more he avoids friction, the easier it becomes for these moments to happen again and again and again. Until one day, a realization appears that many men remember for the rest of their lives. Not a fight, not a breakup, just a moment, a small moment, where he suddenly realizes something he has been avoiding. The way she talks to him now is not the way someone talks to a man they respect. What Daniel is experiencing is something that many men struggle to understand while it's happening, because the loss of respect inside a relationship rarely looks the way people expect it to. Most people imagine respect disappearing during dramatic moments, a huge fight, a betrayal, a shouting match that changes everything overnight. But in reality, that's rarely how it works. Respect usually doesn't collapse in a single event. It erodes, slowly, through repetition, through small signals that change how two people see each other over time. Psychologically, respect inside a relationship is closely tied to perceived competence, emotional stability, and leadership within the dynamic. Not dominance, not control, but a sense that the man occupies a stable position inside the relationship, a position that feels solid, predictable, reliable. In the early stages of most relationships, that perception is naturally strong. There is admiration, curiosity, a kind of psychological gravity around the man. His opinions carry weight. His presence influences the direction of things. But over time, certain patterns can start weakening that perception. And here's where the invisible mechanism begins.
When a woman starts testing small boundaries, and those moments pass without friction, the dynamic subtly recalibrates. At first, the tests are tiny: a sarcastic comment, a dismissive tone, a public correction, a decision made without consulting him. Individually, each moment seems harmless, too small to challenge, too small to escalate. But psychologically, every one of these moments sends a signal. And the signal isn't just about what she said, it's about what happened after. Did he push back? Did he hold his position? Or did the moment pass without resistance? Because in relationships, status is constantly being renegotiated in subtle ways. Not consciously, not maliciously, but naturally. Humans constantly read social cues to determine where influence and authority sit within a group, and a relationship is no different. If these small signals repeat without interruption, something very subtle begins to shift in perception. The man who once felt solid inside the relationship slowly begins to look negotiable.
His opinions become easier to dismiss. His reactions become more predictable. His presence becomes less influential in the emotional structure of the relationship. And once that perception changes, the tone of interaction begins to change with it. Not necessarily with cruelty, often without any conscious intention at all, but the dynamic is no longer the same. The respect that once existed hasn't disappeared overnight. It has slowly dissolved through dozens of small moments that didn't seem important at the time. And that's why many men struggle to understand when the change actually happened. Because the moment they finally notice it, the process has usually been happening for a long time. For many men, the realization doesn't arrive during an argument. It doesn't come during a dramatic confrontation, and it rarely appears in a moment where someone clearly says something outrageous. Instead, it often arrives in a quiet moment that seems almost insignificant, a moment where something inside the interaction suddenly feels undeniable. For Daniel, it happens on an ordinary evening. They're sitting at home, talking about something simple, maybe finances, maybe plans for the weekend, maybe a decision that affects both of them. Daniel gives his opinion the same way he has hundreds of times before, calmly, normally. But this time, the reaction he receives feels different. She sighs, then she responds with a tone that feels strangely dismissive. Not angry, not emotional, just certain, as if what he just said doesn't really need to be considered. And for a second, Daniel pauses, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. It's the kind of tone people use when they're correcting a mistake, or explaining something obvious, or speaking to someone whose opinion doesn't really change the outcome. And in that moment, something clicks, a realization that doesn't arrive as a sentence, it arrives as a feeling. The feeling that the dynamic between them is no longer what it once was. Daniel suddenly starts remembering other moments, the dinner with friends, the small corrections, the jokes, the decisions made without asking him. All those moments he dismissed suddenly rearrange themselves in his memory, and together they form a pattern that he can no longer ignore. But the most uncomfortable part of the realization is this: the moment he notices the loss of respect is usually not the moment it actually happened. It's the moment he finally becomes conscious of it. Because by the time a man feels that shift clearly enough to recognize it, the dynamic has already been changing for months, sometimes years. And that's why this realization hits so deeply for many men. It forces them to confront a possibility they never wanted to consider, that the respect they thought was still there may have quietly disappeared long before they noticed. What happens after that realization is rarely dramatic. Most men don't explode. They don't start a massive argument. They rarely suddenly confront everything that has been happening. Something much quieter usually happens instead. They withdraw, not physically, but psychologically. After that moment, Daniel starts noticing something about his own behavior. He speaks less, not because he's trying to, but because part of him already expects the reaction, the sigh, the correction, the subtle dismissal. So instead of engaging, he begins to skip the moment entirely. If a decision needs to be made, sometimes he simply says, "Whatever you think." Not because he doesn't care, but because somewhere inside it feels easier than pushing against the resistance. Arguments become shorter, not because they're resolved, but because Daniel stops insisting on his position. And over time, something even subtler begins to change. His presence inside the relationship becomes quieter. He starts choosing peace over influence, silence over friction, accommodation over disagreement. And from the outside, this can look like maturity, like calmness, like a man who simply avoids unnecessary conflict.
But internally, the experience feels very different. It feels like slowly disappearing inside your own relationship. Because respect has a strange psychological property. When it weakens, the person who lost it often feels the change before they can explain it. A certain hesitation appears in the way Daniel speaks, a certain caution in how he expresses disagreement. almost like someone walking carefully through a space where they once moved freely. And the most difficult part is that this change often happens without either person openly acknowledging it. There's no conversation where someone says, "I no longer respect you." Instead, the dynamic just settles into a new shape, a shape where one voice carries less weight than it used to. And once a relationship reaches that point, many men start adapting in ways they never expected. They stop sharing certain thoughts. They stop challenging certain decisions. They stop trying to lead certain conversations. Not because they suddenly lost the ability to, but because somewhere along the way, they stopped believing it would matter. At this point, many men start asking the same question. When exactly did this happen? They replay conversations in their heads. They revisit old arguments. They search for a specific moment where everything changed. But the uncomfortable truth is that most of the time, that moment doesn't exist. Not as a single event. Because the real shift didn't happen in one day. It happened across dozens of moments that felt too small to confront, too small to react to, too small to recognize as part of a larger pattern. And this is where many men misunderstand the nature of respect inside a relationship. They imagine respect as something stable, something that either exists or doesn't. But in reality, respect behaves more like momentum. It's reinforced through interactions, strengthened through consistent signals, and weakened through repeated contradictions. Every time a man maintains his position calmly, respect tends to stabilize. Every time a boundary is reinforced, the dynamic becomes clearer. But when small dismissals accumulate without resistance, something subtle happens. The psychological frame of the relationship begins to change. And once that perception shifts, the behavior follows naturally. Not necessarily with bad intentions, not always consciously, but the tone changes, the reactions change, the expectations change. And by the time a man begins asking himself when the respect disappeared, he's often asking the wrong question. Because the real question is not, when did she stop respecting him? The real question is, when did the dynamic start allowing that shift to happen? And for many men, the most unsettling realization is this. The moment they remember most clearly is not the moment the respect disappeared. It's the moment they finally saw what had already been happening for a long time. One of the most interesting things about this experience is how many men can remember the exact moment they noticed it. Ask enough men who have been through long relationships, and you'll hear a similar pattern. They may not remember every argument, they may not remember every disagreement, but many of them remember a specific moment where something suddenly became clear. A comment, a look, a tone of voice, a small moment that revealed something they could not longer ignore. And once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. But what makes this realization so uncomfortable is that it rarely feels like a sudden discovery. It feels more like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. Because once that awareness appears, the past starts looking different. Moments that once seemed harmless now carry a different meaning. Small interactions that felt insignificant now feel like early signals. And many men find themselves asking the same question after the realization. How long has this actually been happening? Sometimes it's months. Sometimes it's years. And that realization can be difficult because it forces a man to confront something deeper about relationships. Dynamics are always evolving. Respect is never permanently guaranteed. And the small moments inside a relationship often matter more than the dramatic ones. Because dramatic moments are easy to recognize, small patterns are not. Which is why the exact moment a man realizes he has lost respect in a relationship often feels so powerful. Not because it's the beginning of the change, but because it's the moment he finally sees the change that had already been happening.
And once a man becomes aware of that shift, he starts seeing relationship dynamics very differently, not just in his own life, but everywhere. Because once you recognize the pattern, you begin noticing it in conversations, in couples around you, in the subtle signals most people ignore. And that's why I'm curious about something. If you've ever experienced this shift in a relationship, what was the moment you first noticed it? Not the beginning, the moment you realized something had already changed. Let me know in the comments. And if you want to understand the hidden dynamics that shape modern relationships and the male experience inside them, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because these patterns are happening around us every day. Most people just don't see them yet.